Hi, I'm Jim Riley, and welcome to Worse, stories of strength and courage from the old times. Our ancestors went through a lot, and they still managed to get us to the present day. We'll get through this. So let's hear some stories of how they did it. Now I'm going to be cooking a chicken sausage while we do this. Putting that on right now. I'm also going to be having a beer, in this case a Newburgh brown ale from a very good brewery not far from here. These are not sponsors. I don't have sponsors yet. But if you want to pause this, get something to eat and drink and sit down, get going. You know, we always spend a lot of time wearing masks these days, this being November 24th, 2020, and seems like I have that N95 mask with me everywhere I go. It's a pain in the butt. It's not comfortable, makes my ears hurt. Came across this story, not story, but a letter from the Dust Bowl, a dark time in American history. This is a letter written in Oklahoma, June 30th, 1935. Listen to this. Dear Evelyn, your continued interest in our effort to tie a knot in the end of the rope and hang on is most stimulating. I thought that was a recent expression, tie a knot at the end of the rope and hang on, but apparently not. Our recent transition from rain-soaked eastern Kansas with its green pastures, luxuriant foliage, abundance of flowers, and promise of a generous harvest to the dust-covered desolation of no man's land was a difficult change to crowd into one day's travel. Eleanor has laid aside the medical books for a time. I think Eleanor's our writer, but she's speaking of herself, in the third person there. Wearing our shade hats, with handkerchiefs tied over our faces and Vaseline in our nostrils, we have been trying to rescue our home from the accumulations of wind-blown dust which penetrates wherever air can go. It is an almost hopeless task, for there is rarely a day when at some time the dust clouds do not roll over. Visibility approaches zero and everything is covered again with a silt-like deposit which may vary in depth from a film to actual ripples on the kitchen floor. I keep oiled cloths on the windowsills and between the upper and lower sashes. They help just a little to retard or collect the dust. Some seal the windows with the gummed paper strips used in wrapping parcels, but no method is fully effective. We buy what appears to be red cedar sawdust with oil added to use in sweeping our floors and do our best to avoid inhaling the irritating dust. In telling you of these conditions, I realize that I expose myself to charges of disloyalty to this western region. A good Kansas friend suggests that we should imitate the Californian attitude toward earthquakes and keep to ourselves what we know about dust storms. Since the very limited rains of May in this section gave some slight ground for renewed hope, optimism has been the approved policy. Printed articles or statements by journalists, railroad officials, and secretaries of small-town chambers of commerce have heralded too enthusiastically the return of prosperity to the drought region. And in this part of the country, that is the one durable basis for any prosperity whatever. There is nothing else to build on. But you wish to know the truth, so I am telling you the actual situation, though I freely admit that the facts are themselves often contradictory and confusing. Sound familiar? Early in May, with no more grass or even weeds on our 640 acres than on your kitchen floor, and even the scanty remnants of dried grasses from last year cut off and blown away, we decided, like most of our neighbors, to ship our cattle to grass in the central part of the state. We sent 27 head, retaining here the heifers coming fresh this spring. The shipping charge on our part of the carload was $46. Pasture cost us $7 for a cow and calf for the season and $5 for a yearling. Whether this venture brings profit or loss depends on whether the cattle make satisfactory gains during the summer and whether prices remain reasonable or fall back to the level that most people would desire. We farmers here in the United States might as well recognize that we are a minority group and that the prevailing interest of the nation as a whole is no longer agricultural. Hard to hear now, hard to hear then. Hay for the horses and the heifers remaining here costs us $3 per ton, brought by truck from eastern Oklahoma. The day after we shipped the cattle, the long drought was temporarily broken by the first effective moisture in many months, about 1¼ inches in 2 or 3 gentle rains. All hope of a wheat crop had been abandoned by March or April. Contrary to many published reports, a good many people had left this country either temporarily or permanently before any rains came. And they were not merely drifters, as is frequently alleged. In May, a friend in the southwestern county of Kansas voluntarily sent me a list of the people who had already left their immediate neighborhood or were packed up and ready to go. The list included 109 persons and 26 families, substantial people, most of whom had been in that locality over 10 years and some as long as 40 years. In these families, there had been 2 deaths from dust pneumonia. Remember that when I tell you a story later about my dad. Others in the neighborhood were ill at that time. Fewer actual residents have left our neighborhood, but on a 60-mile trip yesterday to procure tractor repairs, we saw many pitiful reminders of broken hopes and apparently wasted effort. Little abandoned homes where people had drilled deep wells for the precious water, had set trees and vines, built reservoirs and fenced-in gardens, with everything now walled in, half buried by banks of drifted soil, told a painful story of loss and disappointment. I grieved especially over one lonely plum thicket, buried to the tips of the twigs, and a garden with a fence closely built of boards for wind protection, now enclosing only a hillock of dust covered with the blue flower bull nettles, which no winds or sands can discourage. Now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in this letter. Naturally, you wonder why we stay where conditions are so extremely disheartening. Why not pick up and leave as so many others have done? It is a fair question, but one that's hard to answer. Recently, I talked with a young university graduate of very superior attainments. He took the ground that in such a case, sentiment could and should be discarded. He may be right. Yet I cannot act or feel or think as if the experience of our 27 years of life together had never been, and they are all bound up with the little corner to which we have given our continued and united efforts. To leave voluntarily, to break all these closely knit ties for the sake of a possibly greater comfort elsewhere, seems like defaulting on our task. We may have to leave. We can't hold out indefinitely without some return from the land, some source of income, however small. But I think I can never go willingly or without pain, as that as yet seems unendurable. We long for the garden and the little chickens, the trees and birds and wild flowers of the years gone by. Perhaps if we do our part, these good things may return someday, for others, if not for ourselves. Will joins me in earnest hope for your recovery. The dust has been particularly aggravating to his bronchial trouble, but he keeps on working. A great reddish-brown dust cloud is rising now from the southeast, so we must get out and do our night work before it arrives. Our thoughts go with you. People tying masks over their faces, people dying of bronchial ailments, people trying to figure out if it's okay to go on. We are not the first. Okay, now I'd like to jump to a more modern thing. I work as an actor, and as you know, this has been a pretty brutal time for people who work in the theater profession. This is a memory written recently on Facebook by a casting director friend of mine. It's been a little over a year since I left New York City and moved to my new home here in Scottsdale, Arizona. I've actually purchased a car and drive it, something I haven't done in 45 years. A lot of people in New York City never have to drive, isn't that amazing? Having taken a subway every day of my life, I'm doing well health-wise, but I must say my heart aches for all my friends in New York City and around the country who work in regional theaters. I know we will come back eventually, but right now, things must be very hard. All the wonderful, talented actors, directors, designers, etc. are now without work. I know how rough a town like New York City can be without the benefit of work to pay the bills. Listen to this. You are in my thoughts and prayers. I moved to New York during the summer of Sam. A madman was going around killing people near parks. Of course, I lived across the street from Prospect Park. We then had a blackout, and areas of the city were burnt to the ground only to remain that way for over 20 years. We lived through the AIDS epidemic, when it seemed like every director and choreographer and actor was falling ill and dying. I remember calling Equity, that's the Actors Union, Actors Equity Association. I remember calling Equity for contracts on actors only to be told they were no longer with us. Unavailable lists full of deceased or ill actors. We lived through 3 recessions and the devastation of 9/11. New York will come back and theater will survive because there is an audience out there waiting to come back to the theater. I remember casting a miniseries for PBS the week after 9/11. We had scheduled some of the cast members from the producers. This was the original cast. It was the hottest ticket in town. They were coming into the audition saying they were playing to half-empty houses. It wasn't long before they were back to capacity. The people came back. It was deemed safe, and they came back. May God bless you all and keep you safe until we're all back. Okay, this is a pretty amazing story, I think, of a long ago time in a place far away. Hold on a second. You see how I'm doing here? I need to turn this. And I just lost my page. It's all right. This will be pretty good with the beer. Okay. Damn. I'm gonna pause. No, I'm not. I don't know how to pause. This is the story of pirates in the eastern seas. A lot of the stories that Europeans knew about what happened in East Asia in the 17th and 16th, 17th, 18th centuries came through the Portuguese because they were some of the first to travel over there. And this is a guy writing an American writing in the 1800s about stories that he learned. This is from an account of his. The writer's name was John S. Sewell, if you want to look it up, from a piece he wrote called The Scourge of the Eastern Seas. The most famous corsairs known to Chinese history, most famous perhaps because of their ferociousness, were a father and son, Qing Chilung and Qing Ching Kung. They flourished around the time of the Manchu conquest in 1644. The son was familiarly called Quoshing, but is better known by his Portuguese Latinized name, Koxinga. The father, after years of adventure, honest and dishonest, untold and untellable, found himself at the head of an immense, nondescript fleet with which he harried the hapless coasts and laid waste the seas. Bribes of wealth and rank decoyed the redoubtable chieftain into the imperial service. He was made supreme commander of the Chinese Navy. In his new position, it became his duty to protect commerce and destroy piracy. He accordingly protected commerce and destroyed piracy. No petty scruples of honor or generous memory stood in the way. It was as a sort of grim atonement for his own crimes that whole squadrons of his former comrades were, with unpitying impartiality, dispatched to the infernal shades. They had a way of writing back in the 1800s, didn't they? He assumed the monopoly of all the lucrative commerce and levied tribute on all manner of craft. He did what he liked, and no power in the empire dared question his right. The emperor even bestowed on his son in marriage a princess of the blood. In course of time, his unchallenged supremacy made him careless. Detected in an intrigue against the government, he was enticed to court, and there found himself in a gilded cage, beyond whose bars he was never again permitted to go. We've heard that term so many times, I guess in this case it was true. Cage with gold bars. There he languished for many years, where he finally died as a prisoner of state. It would take lurid colors to paint the wrath of Koxinga, this was his son now, when it became apparent that the old tiger, his sire, was held in hopeless captivity. No doubt the atmosphere reeked with Chinese rhetoric, whatever that means. Vowing eternal hate to the whole Tatar race, he summoned his fellow ruffians and betook himself to his home on the waves. This was in 1646. For more than 30 years, his name was the terror of the seas. He preyed upon commerce until, from sheer fright, commerce shut itself up in port and dared not come out. As a result, the few prizes he caught were not enough to maintain and feed his vast squadron. Then he invaded the shores and plundered not only villages and towns, but capital cities and provinces. He besieged Nanking. He captured and fortified Amoy. He finally stole and occupied the island of Formosa, that is what we now know as Taiwan. Seized the government, established arsenals and ports for his fleets, and thence hurled his filibustering raids upon the opposite coasts. This guy can write. At last, his bloody incursions. You think we've been through tough stuff? Listen to this. At last, his bloody incursions became such an intolerable scourge to the empire, which could neither prevent nor resist them, that the extraordinary measure was adopted of abandoning for the time all trade on the seas and withdrawing the entire population from the coast. This was actually done, probably the only instance of its kind in history, and the Chinese were the only people who would ever have dreamed of tactics so absurd and so masterly. For hundreds of leagues up and down the shores of the great realm, there stretched between the hungry vampires and their victims a strip of abandoned seacoast 12 miles broad, whose fields lay untilled, whose once populous cities and villages lay deserted and crumbling in decay, whose useless junks slumbered and foundered at their moorings in the harbors. Byron's dream, which was not all a dream, sounds almost like the work of a newspaper reporter writing up the details. Quote, "The rivers, lakes, and ocean all stood still, and nothing stirred within their silent depths. Ships sailorless lay rotting on the sea." Macau was accepted, and that because the Portuguese, that was a Portuguese colony. The Portuguese colonists were presumed to be competent to protect themselves. It was 7 years before the deserted sea fringe of the empire was reoccupied and trade was allowed to flow into its wonted channels. The death of the dreaded Koxinga soon after closed the 17th century piratical era. Imagine having to deal with a problem like that. That's one of the things I've taken some comfort from reading about old times, reading about what they've been through, ancient, recent, that people have been through tough things. Might be people listening to this right now who were, whose grandparents were alive at the time of that lady writing from the Dust Bowl. I had a tough thing a few years ago where I was building a house here, and the edge of the excavation fell in a little bit while I was working there, and a big rock kind of tumbled sideways out of the side of the cut and hit me in the leg just above the ankle, and I would say it was almost enough to break my ankle. It really, really hurt. It didn't heal for months. And I remember I just fell to my knees and I just dug my fingers into the ground and just wailed in pain until the pain went away. And I was pretty proud of myself that I kept going through that. I went home and laid on the couch for a while, and then I was back the next day working, limping, but I kept working. Like I said, I was pretty proud of that. Hold on. And then I remembered a story I read. I went to college up in Ithaca, New York, and there was a story in the paper that came into my mind. And son of a gun, I found it online. United Press International, they're one of the big three wire services that provide news stories to, newspapers and websites all over the world. United Press International, UPI, had this story on their website in their archives. Listen to this. So this is October 14th, 1981. Ovid, New York. Authorities have decided not to press charges against a woman who performed a cesarean section on herself with a pocket knife so she would not have to carry her baby anymore. The premature infant survived and is now living with foster parents. Tompkins County District Attorney Joseph Jock, really, a story on top of everything else, guy has to be named Jock. Joseph Jock said Wednesday that Deborah Stagg, 29, had faced a reckless endangerment charge in the case, but in the end, officials decided not to hold her responsible. There won't be any other charges, Jock said, adding that the woman remains in Willard Psychiatric Center. The Ithaca woman cut herself open August 16th and delivered the child, and then sutured herself with an ordinary needle and thread. She was taken into custody hours afterwards, when police found her walking the streets in blood-stained garments, carrying the premature baby in a backpack. Yeah, it really hurt when that rock hit my leg. Police said the woman had not gone into labor, but just decided she no longer wanted to carry the baby. The infant was about 7 weeks premature. Okay, so the kid survived. The kid was put in foster care. So he's about 40 now. This is 1981. Wonder what his life's been like. Hey, Billy, you ever have abandonment issues? Oh, yeah. So that certainly put my hurt ankle in perspective. And something else did too. I grew up with stories from my dad, my mom and my dad, like so many people have. My dad was born in 1928. Donald Riley was his name. And so he was 13 years old when the U.S. entered World War II. And with most able-bodied men drafted for the war by December of 41, even Rosie the Riveter and her brave sisters weren't enough to keep the wheels of industry turning. So basically, if you had a pulse, you had a job. So at the age of 14, my dad got a job in a steel mill. When I was 14, I was a caddy. My sister was a lifeguard, but my dad had a job in a steel mill when he was 14 years old. So think about it, he grew up in the Depression. It's barely over, things are starting to look better, then bam, we're at war. So for a while, this is insane. My dad's schedule was 8 hours on, 8 hours off. So he'd go to work at 8 in the morning, work till 4. Then he'd go home, have dinner, sleep as much as he could, be back to work at midnight, work till 8 a.m., go home, have breakfast, sleep as much as he could, go back to work at 4 and work till midnight. Like that. I think he said he did that for a whole week. Whose idea was that? But times were desperate. They needed as much production as they could to keep the war, keep us in the war. Things were not looking good for a long time. After the U.S. joined the war, we were not winning. So, one of his jobs was breaking up slag. Now, slag is the waste product that's left over from making steel. Comes out of some process in the furnace as a molten thing, and then it hardens basically into like solid rock. So, it was winter. My dad was working outdoors, and he was given a sledgehammer to break up this slag into pieces where he could load it into a cart and a pair of safety glasses. So, can you imagine that? 14-year-old kid, and then the supervisor's like, just go break that stuff up, we'll be inside, see ya. The safety glasses kept slipping off because he was sweating. So he just had him hang on the chain around his neck. But then he landed a hit with the sledgehammer, and a piece of the slag flew up and hit him in the chest hard enough to sting through his winter coat. And he said to himself, I better put those glasses back on. Put them back on. Another blow with the sledgehammer. The next piece that flew up broke one of the lenses of the safety glasses. He went inside, he showed them to the supervisor, and the supervisor said, am I happy to see this? And he hung those glasses up where everyone could see them. My dad believes that it was an intervention of God in his life that piece of slag hit him in the chest and reminded him to put those on. He said to me, what would my life have been like if I had had one eye? He went to college on the GI Bill. He said, I wouldn't have been able to get into the military if I had one eye. Never would have gotten the GI Bill, never would have gone to college, probably never would have met your mother. You guys would never be here. So, but anyway, he did not lose an eye. He grew up, and the year after World War II ended, he wanted to get in on the GI Bill, which enabled veterans to go to college, for the government to foot the bill for veterans to go to college. He wanted to get on the GI Bill before it expired. So in 1946, at the age of 17, He waited till his parents were out of town, then he went to his grandfather, who like was in like the early stages of dementia, and got him to sign a permission slip so he could go to the Marines when he was underage. So how do you become a Marine? Some of you know this, maybe some of you don't. You go to boot camp. There are 2 boot camps in the US. Paris Island on the East Coast, San Diego on the West Coast. My dad went to Paris Island. People who are veterans have told me that Paris Island in 1946 is not what it is today. My father taught us a poem growing up, or I guess you'd say a poem. Yeah, we'd sit around the dinner table. This is Paris Island, the land that God forgot, where the sand is 14 inches deep and the sun is burning hot. Have you ever had a job where you were punched, slapped, kicked, and choked? My dad did. And it was called Marine Corps Boot Camp. The first day he was there, they told their new recruits, we're going to give you a pair of shirt and pants and a belt. You put on the shirt, you put on the pants, you leave the belt draped around your shoulders. Well, one guy's pants were too big, so he very reasonably thought, I'll put on my belt. So he put on his belt. But that's not what they told him to do. The drill instructor came up to the guy, pulled the belt out from his belt loops, looped it around his neck, choked him. What'd I tell you to do? What'd I tell you to do? The guy's like, you told me to put it around my neck, told me about it. So another guy, one of the new recruits, just freaked out. And he said, I didn't join the Marines, I didn't join the Marines. And he started to run away across the parade ground. And my dad saw this. The drill instructor just ran up along the side of the guy and went right under the chin, laid him out flat. Can you imagine a work environment where your supervisors can do that to you? And this was in the United States and in the lifetime of people who are still alive. Some of the punishments were almost comical. They had a PX on the base, of course, a place where you could go and buy little sundries and snacks and things like that. But the new recruits were told, you're not allowed to have ice cream. I don't know, there were a million rules, and that was one of them. One of the guys snuck out and got some ice cream, and they caught him. So this is back in the days when a half gallon of ice cream would come in a cardboard box. So in the middle of the day, they made the guy stand at attention in the parade ground, hot, no shade. This is Paris Island, South Carolina. They took the box off of the block of ice cream and set it on the guy's head, and he had to stand at attention until it melted. He wasn't allowed to swat flies. That was his punishment for not doing what he was told. My dad got some casual abuse directed at him once. I mean, everyone got some. He was called to the drill instructor's office, and when you were called to the drill instructor's office, you had to, in one leap, get exactly centered in the door of the drill instructor's office. So you would have to jump in and boom, come to attention, right centered in the door. And then the drill instructor, without looking up, would say, come in. Then you had one leap to get standing at attention exactly centered in front of his desk. My dad acted that out, this ridiculous, like, spastic move where you'd have to do like a one-legged standing broad jump and end up at attention. So he did that, and the drill instructor said, Riley, your mother sent you a box of cookies. The drill instructor had the box in his lap. The drill instructor opened it up. He said, have one. So my father broke attention long enough to take a cookie, put it in his mouth, went back to attention, chewing his cookie, and the drill instructor said, dismissed. And my father never saw that box of cookies again. But I guess then they could say, we gave the cookies to your son. He said there were times when they would stand at attention and the drill instructor would yell, what are you? And they would have to shout back, we are slime, sir. I think the idea was that battle wouldn't be so much of a shock and following orders would be second nature if boot camp was like this. And by the way, they also trained with tear gas. That consisted of the drill instructor and a bunch of recruits putting on gas masks and going in a sealed chamber. The drill instructor would pull the pin on a tear gas grenade. And then he would shout, take off your masks. course, he kept his mask on, the drill instructor, but they would take off their masks and they would be trapped in a room full of tear gas where they would be coughing and choking and vomiting. And my father said, then the drill instructor said, sing. My dad recalls that they sang Swanee River and Sioux City Sioux. And he acted it out pretty evocatively. I'm imitating to you what my father imitated to us around the dinner table back in the 1960s and 1970s. All my life, I've been able to say my father is a Marine. And that's a great source of pride. And I say is because you may be active duty, you may be retired, but once you're a Marine, you are always a Marine. There's a guy down the street from us here where we live, and he has a Marine Corps flag flying in front of his house. And I was able to say to him proudly, my dad is a Marine. 3 weeks ago, my dad tested positive for coronavirus. And last week he passed away from associated complications, what the doctor called COVID pneumonia. So he came through the Depression, World War II, Paris Island, tour in Korea, and now he's passed the torch on to us. And I have no doubt that his spirit continues to pray for us all. We will get through this. We've been through worse. See you next week.